Okay, so Wednesday, April 19th, we're reading a chapter of History Smashers, and then we're going to work on our essays. By the end of today, you should have your introduction and your first 2 body paragraphs done. Ready to write your last body paragraph tomorrow and write your conclusion on Friday. You'll find information on how to write body paragraphs and introductions and conclusions all in lesson Language Arts 1004. Which we did this morning, or we started this morning. History Smashers, we were reading yesterday, and we had gotten to the point where it was time for people to start the fighting. So I don't know, I think we're going to skip to the next chapter. All right, so the tensions had built, and they knew that pretty soon the soldiers were going to come after them. And they had hidden guns. Like, people had guns at their houses because they hunted with them and stuff, even though they weren't really supposed to have guns. And so the soldiers were planning to go out and take away the people's guns and kind of be mean to them and suppress them. And they thought it was going to be really easy, but they didn't know people had been organizing behind the scenes, and they had a plan. And so they were waiting to see which way the soldiers were coming, by land or by sea. So this is the midnight ride, and the shot heard round the world. Okay, so you've probably read stories about how the first battles of the American Revolution began. It's likely that Paul Revere was the hero of those tales, galloping through the countryside on a midnight ride, shouting, "The British are coming." But that beloved story has grown into a myth that needs a little smashing. For starters, even though Paul Revere gets all the credit, he was only one of many writers who sounded the warning on the night of April 18th. British troops crossed Boston Harbor that night with 2 main orders. And one of the other writers was like a 16-year-old girl named Sybil Luddington, who did the same thing. So the orders the British had were go to Lexington, capture the rebel leaders John Hancock and Sam Adams, and destroy all the military supplies being stored there, so all the guns. Dozens of people rode to spread the warning, but only a few, Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott, made it into the history books. Most of the writers' names aren't even known. It's very unlikely any of them ran around shouting, "The British are coming." At that time, most colonists still considered themselves British citizens too. They probably would have called the King's soldiers redcoats or regulars. But at least for a while, there wouldn't have been any shouting at all. Their warning Hancock and Adams, required them to reach Lexington without being caught. That meant being quiet. So that whole idea that they ran off shouting into the night was a myth. It was Samuel Prescott, not Paul Revere, who managed to complete his full mission that night. He rode to Lexington, avoided capture, and went on to Concord to warn people there. Revere made it to Lexington, but British soldiers captured him later. Dawes managed to avoid getting caught, but his horse threw him off and then ran away. So Dawes ended up having to walk back to Lexington. Well, that's not very heroic, is it? So why is Paul Revere the famous one? Probably because Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote a poem about him. "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man who is now alive who remembers that famous day and year." But when I was a kid, I learned like a naughty version of that. "Listen, my children, you will hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. He jumps on his horse and he stepped on the gas. The horse fell down and he fell on his..." Oh, I did not say it. But as a kid, that was what I learned. Longfellow wrote this poem just before the American Civil War, thinking that a story about a good old-fashioned patriot might lift America's spirits. That poem didn't offer a particularly accurate account of what happened, but people liked it anyway, and Paul Revere became known as the lone hero riding into the night. Maybe it was because his name was the easiest to rhyme. Once all of the famous and not so famous writers had done their job, British soldiers no longer had the element of surprise on their side. Hancock and Adams fled to safety, and when the Redcoats arrived on the morning of April 19th, members of the militia were waiting for them, guns in hand. The Redcoats confronted the militia. Someone fired a gun. Who was it? It depends on who you ask. Most British accounts blame the colonists. The colonists said it was the Redcoats who fired first, and they worked hard to get that message out in the newspaper. Massachusetts Patriots, and this is not a sports team, knew they'd get more support from other colonies if people believed the British soldiers had fired first. Whoever fired first, that gunshot started the American Revolution. So that shot at Lexington was the shot heard round the world, right? Well, no, that famous phrase actually comes from the poem Concord Hymn, which was written by Ralph Waldo Emerson in 1830s for the dedication of a monument. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. The shots fired at Concord came after the Battle of Lexington, but Emerson didn't get asked to write a poem about that. Like the famous Revere poem, this one is a little misleading when it comes to what really happened. So Lexington was the first real battle of the Revolution, but it didn't last long. The colonists were outnumbered. There were only about 80 of them compared to several hundred redcoats, but they held their ground until that first shot was fired. Then chaos broke loose, and it wasn't long before they had to retreat. 8 militiamen were killed and another 9 or 10 injured. There were no photographers or artists at the battle to capture the scene, so all we know comes from the people who told stories. But an artist did paint a picture a few weeks later. He interviewed people and then he published it. His engraving, though, doesn't tell the real story. We've already learned that sometimes people would write poems and make pictures that weren't quite true in order to manipulate the public and make them believe what they wanted them to believe.
Propaganda.
Propaganda. It shows the British troops in neat lines, keeping ranks. In reality, both groups broke ranks. The whole scene was pretty much a hot mess, but they didn't want to paint that because it wouldn't look good. Only one British soldier was injured. It was another story when the Redcoats marched up the road to Concord. There, 100 British soldiers faced around 400 members of the militia. By the time the British arrived, most of the supplies there had been moved. They destroyed what was left and then began to retreat, only to be chased back to Boston by a mob of militiamen who fired at them from every rock wall and tree stump they could find. And when I was a little girl, we also had this song. We fired our guns, but the British kept a-coming. There weren't quite as many as there was a while ago. Fired once more, and they began a-running down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the British especially suffered heavier losses than they'd expected. There were 73 dead British, 49 dead Americans. Remember the idea the British had, where they hoped the colonists would call it a day after 1 or 2 losses? That wasn't working out. So it's kind of like Ukraine, where the Russians thought they had so much more weapons and people that the Ukrainians would just give in, but they underestimated the Ukrainians, and they're still fighting today, going on their 2nd year of fighting. So they wrote back to England, whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. In other words, these Americans are better fighters than we thought. And then it says, who's singing Yankee Doodle now? So Yankee Doodle is the song, another propaganda song they wrote at the time.
Yankee Doodle had a time riding on a pony.
Stuck a feather in his cap.
And his heart called him macaroni.
Yankee Doodle, keep it up. Yankee Doodle dandy. Stick a feather in your cap and call it. Oh, and with the girls be handy. So Yankee Doodle was a song made to make fun of the colonists, to make them sound silly, right? But after they made the song, the colonists decided that they liked it and that they would use it against the British. So it became a popular song. And now we start with the spies and some words on spies. We're going to learn about Benjamin Church tomorrow. All righty, friends. At this point, I'm going to set up some breakout rooms. I would like anyone who has not started writing their essay, to stay with me so I can help you get started.